In a world where even the smallest disagreements can lead to arguments, violence, and even death, two brothers tackle the difficult subjects. This podcast is not just about dissecting topics from two different perspectives. It's also about how to have conversations on difficult topics while avoiding the urge to tear someone's head off and vomit down the bloody stump of their neck. So to start out, this conversation is going to be looking at, in a short half-hour window, monopolies and trust busting. And I thought before we begin, because of a few conversations I've had with other people, it might be worthwhile to just give a few definitions. And so the definition that I had for monopoly is when there is a sole supplier for a product, and there's an absence of competition. Does that sound about right to you?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it does. I think, and that was more common in the time of, the 1800s or times like that, where the queen or the king would grant a full monopoly, where one person had complete control over something. But yeah, I agree.
Yeah. The other two terms that often come up are the duopoly or the oligopoly, which is, of course, two companies or entities or multiple, but a small group of the entities that are also the sole providers of a product or the absence of competition. Now, one of the things I ran across when looking around on this stuff is that some people decide that there's monopoly if a company has maybe 70% of the market share. Or 80% of the market share. And so I guess it's debatable whether you have to have all or just a very large portion of it. And I don't know what your feeling is on that.
My feeling is that's monopoly power. So if, for example, you had 70% of the market and you could throw your weight around, it wouldn't be robust competition. So I would just call that monopoly power. And I think at times, I don't think the government waits for a complete monopoly to step in and exert control and try to reduce the monopoly. When it sees that monopoly power increasing, then it makes the decision at some point to step in and control that company.
Okay. All right. Good. Do you want to start off with an opening statement of your position?
An opening salvo? Yes. Yeah. So the first thing I think that is important to remember about a monopoly is that a monopoly cannot do whatever it wants as far as a market. So just to give one example, if let's say I had a monopoly on iPhones or something, well, I wouldn't charge $1 million per iPhone because nobody would buy it. I would, and I wouldn't charge 10,000 because not enough people would buy it. I would try to find that price point. I think every capitalist, every free marketist or monopolist is trying to some degree, maximize his or her profits. And the monopolist is the same, where he tries to find that price point where if he raised the price $1 more, he'd sell fewer, and he'd make less money. If he lowered the price $1, he'd sell more, but not as much as he would lose by having the price $1 higher. Now, it's obviously impossible to find that point, but they're trying to find that point. They don't want to charge very, very little and sell a ton of them if they're not going to make very much money unless they have to. Now, if you have a monopolist and somebody else enters the marketplace, naturally the prices are going to come down a little bit, because if he was maximizing before, the guy next to him says, well, I could charge a little bit less, $1 less, $10 less, $100 less, and then capture a large part of the market. So a monopolist doesn't have complete power, he just has a lot of power. And a company with a lot of power compared to one with not that much, for example, one with a lot of market share compared to one with not as much, sometimes can exert market power on that other company. The other thing to remember about monopolies is complete ones are rare. As we talked about just recently, even Standard Oil, when it was taken over, had about 90% of the market share. And an interesting thing from the biography of John D. Rockefeller about Standard Oil was They had 90% of the market share, but just before the government with Teddy Roosevelt came in to start trust busting, as they called it, they were beginning to lose market share because oil had been discovered in the Middle East and in Russia. And so all of a sudden they were going to lose this market share. Now, he had done some things over the years, part of it with government help. I guess back then, one of the things that people did was bribe their elected leaders. So he wasn't the only one, but he did bribe his elected leaders. That was some of the way they got some market share. Another way was taking control of other companies. But as I said before, one thing I was alluding to before that I should have mentioned is the other reason that it's difficult for a monopolist to charge too much money is because a monopoly is hard to hold on to. So if I have a product and I'm charging a ton for that product and I'm making excessive profits, that's a great invitation to other companies to come in and start doing the same thing. So one of the things that John D. Rockefeller did was to keep his prices low. And sometimes he's accused of raising them and making exorbitant profits, but he never did that. From the beginning, his plan was to keep profits low so he could gobble up more and more market share. And the more he raised profits, the more other companies who didn't have the same efficiency and costs would come in and began to compete against him. So anyway, those are some of my thoughts about monopoly and where it comes from. I guess also I would say it's hard to hold on to a monopoly without government assistance. And we can talk a little bit about where I think that assistance comes from, but I don't want to monopolize the conversation. If you want to answer some of that.
Sure. So briefly, one of the arguments I've heard you make in the past is that the free market will always correct, and that the idea to keep the government out of the process is fine because eventually the market will correct. And I would probably agree with that. But the problem is that before a market does naturally correct, there's damage. And that damage is not just to abstract concepts like the economy. Families suffer, people lose. And so this is why we need an impartial observer to create rules and enforce those rules. The busting up of trusts, the dismantling of abusive monopolies is an example of that sort of oversight. Monopolies can stifle competition. That lack of competition will burden consumers with higher prices, can burden consumers with higher prices or inferior products. A healthy, competitive marketplace ensures that this doesn't happen, and transparent oversight ensures a healthy marketplace.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Was it Joseph Schumpeter talked about creative destruction, and I think that's what the marketplace does. It's the free market. It creates this creative destruction where at times companies go out of business. People lose their investments. People lose their jobs. And that's an unfortunate thing, and it's easy for me to talk about how unfortunate it is when it hasn't happened to me, but so I don't want to minimize that. I think it's a very important point that you make. So what you and I have to do is try and decide what is the best way or what is the fastest way to move past those unfortunate times when things are difficult. When I think of monopoly, there's certain monopolies that just happen naturally. For example, if you had bought a whole bunch of real estate on a beautiful river, well, nobody can really compete with that. There's only so much river real estate, right?
Sure.
So unless you bought the whole river, it'd be, you can't gain a monopoly, but you can gain a lot of power and charge an exorbitant amount if there's not that many people around. Another way that they happen naturally, I think, is when the new product comes out. I mean, the iPhone for a while had a tremendous amount of power. What's interesting about that is when we look back at the introduction of the iPhone, they didn't charge, it's exactly what we talked about before. It wasn't exorbitant prices. It was prices where they could sell a ton of those products and gobble up and try and keep that market share. Now, I'll agree that at times these companies can behave a bit unfairly. Oh, before we get to that, then I think other causes of monopoly power are, for example, high investment costs, economies of scope and scale. So large companies typically can exert a lot of different power because they have, if it takes a high amount of investment to get them in a particular market, how do you compete when you have to have all this capital to compete with them? So you're absolutely right that sometimes it takes a while for competition to enter the marketplace until there's some sort of other product that people weren't expecting that doesn't take as much of an investment costs, until those investment costs come down because technology has caught up. Those types of things can matter. But I think that if we look back at all of the examples of monopoly in our country, we'll see that for the most part, they come from other sources. They come from things like licensing requirements, regulation requirements, subsidies. When I looked a bit at the subsidies that are paid to different industries in our country, and it's amazing. Amtrak receives $1.4 billion every year. Farms through 2010 were receiving subsidies of $52 billion per year, and 6% of that went to corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup, cornstarch, and soy oils. Ethanol subsidies totaled $54 billion. The big three auto companies receive a ton of subsidies. And how can small companies compete against all these companies that are receiving subsidies? We look at licensing. When I was in college, I wanted to become a sprinkler repair person because I saw that they could make a lot of money. Well, one of the reasons that was is because you need a license to get it to be a sprinkler repair person. In fact, in order to get the license, you need to work for a licensed sprinkler repair person for 2 years. So there was no way for me to step in to do that. Now, licensing, the argument that people who say we should have licensing as well, it keeps us safe, all these different things. A sprinkler, I don't know how much danger there is to it. I've done sprinklers since in my own house. They're not that dangerous. Really, these are just ways to keep other people out of the marketplace. Even the American Medical Association, Milton Friedman talked for years about how that allowed a ton of monopoly power in our country. In fact, one example of that, this is an interesting factoid. Between 1980 and 2005, there was a moratorium on new medical schools in our country because the American Medical Association and others were telling the government, listen, if we get too many doctors, their salaries will come down. And we won't get the best I guess maybe thinking that we won't get the best doctors anymore. But they were reducing the supply of doctors so that the salaries of doctors would stay high, which obviously is going to keep the cost of medical care high. That's why we have so many foreign doctors. One of the reasons we have so many foreign doctors in our country. But I would say that so many of these issues of monopoly power, that article that you and I were reading that I sent over to you about, what was the article I sent you?
The Cato Institute about the
Ma Bell, yeah. How much of that? I mean, they were a highly regulated industry with a monopoly, and I think most monopoly power in our country historically has come from government interference.
Yeah, you've given me a lot there. I don't know that I can hit every single point, especially if you want to have a dialogue about it. So I'll just kind of run through a couple of them. In the beginning, you were referencing, you gave the example of real estate on the river, and you also talked about the iPhone. And I don't think that those are great examples of a monopoly because even if you want that iPhone or that property right there on the river, especially when the iPhone came out, there were other options for phones. There's other places you can put your house other than on that river. And so maybe you don't even get a river. Maybe you're forced to go and put your house on a lake or a pond. And so those aren't really what we would consider monopolies because of that. Another one that's worth kind of in that similar vein is the monopoly on diamonds, by the De Beers Corporation. Well, it is a monopoly, but who cares? We don't need diamonds. The whole thing, the whole passion and excitement, interest in diamonds is artificially generated through marketing. And so I think that when we look at monopolies, one of the questions to ask is, are there other options? And so you brought up Ma Bell, which is a great example because for a long period of time, if you wanted to communicate with other people, your options were a letter or a phone call, and that was it. And if that phone call was going through Ma Bell, and so there weren't a lot of other options. Um, and you're absolutely right that the Ma Bell was put through by that the government had a hand in that monopoly, and that was unfortunate choices on their part, and perhaps it was all done with personal gain in mind. Perhaps they were being bribed by AT&T and by other people, or perhaps there really was the idea that um, the country would benefit. They gave some, in the article you sent me, they gave some of the reasons why this was a good thing. I'm not sure if that actually makes sense. But what's interesting is that article you sent me. I think it was written back in the '90s. When I was doing my own research on the Bell monopoly, most of the sources that I found all referenced that the monopoly originated with government assistance. So it seems like that concept that it was a natural monopoly doesn't really isn't held to very much anymore. Do you want to
I
respond there, or you want me
No,
to
no,
keep
no.
going?
I agree 100%. It was, I think, those the people at Ma Bell. I think the guy's name was Vale. I can't remember his full name.
Yeah.
He became CEO and something in the early 1900s, and he thought he didn't believe in competition, much like John D. Rockefeller. He thought competition was unhealthy for the marketplace. That this should be a monopoly, and one of his reasons, I think, um, was the idea that, listen, if we have this big network, how do we get everybody to come in, and if you have all these different standards, all these different types, all these different technologies, it's not going to be very efficient. So he sought the government help to establish a monopoly that lasted for a very, very long time. In
Mm-hmm.
fact, the government, from the beginning, I mean, they nationalized the telephone industry in 1918 and then gave great profits to the company. They were happy for the nationalization because, for whatever reason, those regulators gave the company great profits for their troubles for having their company taken over. In 1919, it was given back, but then there was rate regulation for many, many years. There's all sorts of things throughout that article that talk about what the government did. And I think, yeah, I think this just goes further to the point that it is very difficult. Even a natural monopoly is hard to persist. It's hard to persist in a natural monopoly, in any sort of monopoly, because, yeah, we find all sorts of substitutes. And so the only way that you do it is through government assistance. And I think that's the problem. I think, you said there should be this benevolent, transparent, whatever. And I would say that people, oftentimes you and I talk about, you talk about how capitalists are evil, or, that
By
they're
their
greedy.
nature.
Yes, and I tend to say the same thing about government, but I would make the argument that in both cases they're just normal people, and frankly trying to do some good or whatever. There's probably some evil capitalists and some greedy politicians. Like, I mean, it's funny to think about politicians. On the one hand, you and I would, I think, if we had a discussion about politicians that achieve the highest levels of politics, they're not the greatest of people sometimes.
Probably, yeah.
You probably would agree. Now, we might say, well, bureaucrats, they're different. I don't know. But many times it's just their incentives are wrong, or, they're put in the wrong position. I think unintended consequences abound when you look at things like this. So they probably think they're doing the best thing, and then we end up with a monopoly years later. Any thoughts on that?
Um, yes, you're right, and I think that one of the there's going to be problems in any system. And one of the things that you want to look at is weighing the pros versus the cons. And
Yeah.
so when you look at if we look at it, a free market where the government has stepped back and allowed the market to run itself, the pros are that you have less regulation, that it's a true pure market, and there should be hypothetically lots of competition and lots of innovation. The con is corruption, not corruption, but unethical behavior, where businesses will take advantage of their, the lack of oversight, the lack of rules, and hurt people in the process. And those cons don't just, again, I'll come back to the idea, it's not just the abstract of hurting the economy or hurting some other company. They hurt, individuals and families. So now we take a look at the government and government management, government oversight. And transparency is really important for good government oversight, because it helps to minimize some of the corruption, which is the downside of over management, or one of the downsides, or how we get some of the downsides is through corruption. But the upside is, we avoid things like monopolies. We avoid things like bubbles and other issues that can happen in the marketplace if the government were able to step in and pull back the reins on rampant investment in certain areas. And actually this comes to what you're talking about with the doctors, where there was a pullback on the number of doctors or people that were allowed in medical school, because the thought was we were not going to have, or they were going to have too many doctors in the future. And what's interesting about it is that when you brought up the point, you it sounded like you were saying the motivation was doctors wouldn't be paid very well. And I would say that another way of phrasing or framing that argument is, if we have too many doctors, well, there's not going to be enough jobs for all those doctors. And so clearly someone made a mistake when they said we need to pull back on the number of doctors that were going in. And this was a government program. It was hard to find a lot of details, but I found enough to say that, this was a government program that went into place, and that they were advising some of these medical schools to not allow as many people into their programs. But you look at it from the other side. Let's suppose that there was an open enrollment. That if we can get someone into our medical school, we'll accept them. We'll allow our medical schools to grow by the number of applicants that we have. And then you have a glut of, let's suppose that there would then follow a glut of doctors. Well, it's not just about doctors now not able to make a lot of money, not able to buy a Mercedes-Benz, but you have doctors that have $100,000 of debt that can't pay their bills, can't pay back their student loans because there's too much competition.
Has that happened with lawyers?
What's that?
Has that happened with lawyers?
No. Instead, we have rampant class action lawsuits and the legal system.
Well, maybe, but I'm just saying, is there this problem where all these lawyers are like, we didn't protect the lawyers and make sure that we didn't sit back and say, hey, doctors are that stupid that they're going to create all this debt and run out of jobs. Somehow lawyers were able to figure their way through it. Somehow every other profession doesn't need that protection from doctors. Like it's odd that you'd say that's what would have resulted when it doesn't happen in any other profession.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not saying doctors are stupid, because most of the time when you say a doctor, we're talking about someone that's 30 plus years old that has at least 10 years of college and some little bit of life experience. Yeah. What I'm talking about is an 18-year-old who's trying to figure out which career they should go into, which place they're going to make a lot of money, where they're going to get the jobs when they get through their college education 10 years from now. And I'm not saying that they're stupid. I'm saying that there's plenty of people right now. One of the big conversations we're having in our society at this point in time is things like college debt, because people are coming out of college with massive amounts of debt and ending up, working at the grocery store and not able to fund their debt. I'm not blaming the industry. I'm not blaming the colleges. I'm not blaming the individuals. I'm saying the system doesn't really take into consideration the number of jobs and the people that are going to be applying for those jobs in 4 years or 8 years or whatever the place may be. And maybe there should be some better management to ensure that there's better alignment with the people. Maybe we wouldn't get so many people going in, for dance degrees or English lit degrees, and not really sure where they're going to, what job they're going to get that's going to pay off this student loan that they're going to get when they leave. So you are correct that we haven't had that same problem with lawyers, But I think it'd be interesting to look at some other of these, what we consider high paying jobs, things like engineers and architects, and see if there is some sort of, I don't want to call it a glut, but a mismatch between people looking for jobs in certain areas and the jobs that are available.
Yeah, I think you'd look at that and see that the engineers are doing pretty well. We have a lot of engineers. It's one of the reasons that it's less expensive to do things, because we have a good amount of people that realize they can go into that position and do well.
I don't know that we have a lot of engineers. I've been having a really hard time finding people to work for on this project that I'm working on right now, looking for parking lot engineers, looking for structural engineers, and talking to other realtors and people in the industry. They're all saying there's not a lot of people that are out there.
Okay, but the government didn't restrict the number of engineers. I don't know that that proves anything. Yeah, it's a valuable profession. It's hard. The math is hard, I guess. But when we talk about this stuff, I don't know. It just seems. I guess the doctor. I'm just trying to figure out where to go with this, because though it seems like if there were a lot of doctors and all of a sudden it became. I mean, first of all, it wouldn't happen too suddenly. But if we realize for a moment that, well, there's a lot of people going into the medical profession, you can't make as much money doing it. People wouldn't pay as much for school. Not as many people would go into that profession. They start looking. They would have reacted in the same way that they reacted to these medical schools not accepting as many of them. You don't get accepted, so you go to a different place. You go to a different profession. You become an engineer. You become a lawyer, because there isn't a place for you in the medical school, because it's hard to get in there, because there's fewer people trying to get a fixed number of spots, or sorry, more people trying to get a smaller number of spots. People would have responded, but when government steps in, sometimes with the best of intentions, they do things that either increase monopolies. I mean, the American Medical Association, they probably loved it that there was a moratorium, because that meant higher salaries for the members of their association. When the government steps in, sometimes with the best of intentions, it makes mistakes, like it did with Ma Bell. I mean, if we look back over the past at monopoly power and where it comes from, it typically comes from government. And if you look at, I sent over to you the Dow Jones Industrial, the companies that were a part of it for all those years. It might take a while, but long-lasting monopolies happen with government interference, not through the free market. And that's always the case. If you look at in our country,
Always the case?
Well, long term, yes. What companies have lasted? Why is it, if monopoly power is such a great thing, why is it so hard for these companies to stay a part of the Dow Jones Industrial Average for so long? Why is there so much turnover? If we look at companies in the past that we thought were juggernauts that could never be stopped, we talk about Sears, Kmart, all these, and plenty of other companies that over the years were just powerful economic companies, and now they might be bankrupt or they might be much smaller. It's very difficult for a company to keep that type of power over the long term, but with government help, it's much easier to do it.
You're right, and I agree on all of your points. And so first of all, your comment about the Dow Jones, of course, and just to clarify, the companies in the Dow Jones are not necessarily monopolies, but they are the leader in their particular industry. And so your argument being that you have these leaders that never hold on to their leadership position, and so I guess there may have been some that were monopolies, but typically that's not a requirement to be part of the Dow Jones. And so there's always this turnover that happens with these companies. And I do totally agree, but I'll come back to my original statement, which is that if you have a company that eventually, let's say use Sears for an example, all these people that were working for Sears that lost their jobs as Sears slowly imploded, and all the competition that may have been pushed out by the Sears that were moved into the towns the malls that they moved into. The point of the government should be by making sure that these companies don't get, let's say, too big to fail, or whatever whatever the term might be, that we can ensure people are impacted poorly. Because if these companies do at some point dramatically implode, well, then you've got the issue of the fallout of the people that lose their jobs, the people that lose their pensions, the people that lose their homes, about all this stuff. And that's really the point that I'm looking at, is that I want to make sure that a transparent, benevolent government oversight system is protecting everybody, not simply allowing these entities to hold on to the monopolies.
So,
Go ahead.
you want to? Were you done? Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
I was going to pivot over towards the cable, but if you want to respond to that first, go ahead.
Well, I guess what I would say is, I think the danger that I see there is these large companies have all the incentive, all the greed, all the reason, all the capacity to step in and control government, and not many times not in an obvious or even a malicious way, but they're the ones that are going to send lobbyists. They're the ones that are going to send studies that back up their way of thinking. So it's going to be very hard for government it's going to be very hard for the little people, the poor people, however you want to put it, the small companies to be protected by a government like that, because everybody who's going to go in and try to influence government is going to be big, powerful, monopoly-powered controlling companies, because they are the ones with the capacity and the ability to do it. And so I just, and if we look back at history, what's happened, I mean, with Ma Bell, it's a great example. Their role was to step in and increase competition. And what did they do? They created a monopoly, and probably with the best of intentions, and that's what that article tells me, and many other articles tell me. So it's just believing that that's going to happen, that there's going to be this benevolent, transparent government that doesn't make mistakes. I just don't believe that's going to be the case.
No, you're right. And in fact, you brought up a really good point about how some of these laws are made. And I made a note because I think that will be a really interesting topic for us to have a conversation about. Because you are absolutely correct that that a lot of the lawmakers are making laws about things they don't understand. They're
Yep.
making laws with just a little bit of input from a very small sector. Whether it's corporate interests or public welfare lobbying groups, whatever it might be. And I think that there can definitely be some improvements in that area. And I look forward to having a deeper conversation about that with you. I think it'd be fun to have.
I would, yeah.
But with I think, and I guess to give you some fodder here, one of the monopolies that is presently in existence is with some of the utility companies, and in particular the cable company. And for me, it's very frustrating because it is government permitted government permitted monopoly, where I have access to one cable provider, one DSL provider, one satellite provider. But if I don't have a phone line, I can't use DSL. And if I may not even have access to, I don't think I have access to satellite here. But the services being so different, I can't price compare and product compare because they're very different products. So basically I'm stuck with my one cable provider. And so this is a government permitted monopoly that we need to get rid of, because all monopolies are bad, and even government permitted or not.
Well, I think government permitted are the worst ones. Just because, I mean, yeah, like I guess I would say, yeah, the government permitted are the worst ones typically because, if there's a monopoly that comes about without government help, typically I would have to say either we just haven't, the market hasn't had time to come up with alternatives, or it's just going to take a little bit of time to work it out. I mean, the iPhone, you're right, it was not a monopoly in the sense that there were substitutes, but there almost always are substitutes. There just wasn't a substitute that matched very closely. There wasn't Android. There wasn't Windows phones. So many people thought, well, if I want that, I have to choose from one provider. But that never, I mean, always, companies are going to find a way to come in and compete unless they're restricted by some sort of regulation, some sort of licensing, some sort of unfair competitive practices, non-competitive practices from government like subsidies. So yeah, I think monopolies, we would agree, typically are not in our best interests. But for example, if you had a monopolist, in the same way that you say, well, maybe there'd be this benevolent government that would protect us. If there were a monopolist that provided great products and at low costs, it would be hard to. That's the hardest monopolist to compete with, because everybody else you can find your way around. But if there's just not a lot of profit there, no other capitalist is going to step in to compete with them.
Well, you talked about the fact that there's no or rarely are there natural monopolies, but of course they exist through mergers and acquisitions, right?
Well, that's not a natural monopoly, but yeah, I don't think that's the definition of a natural monopoly. But yeah, I do agree that you can gain a tremendous amount of market power through mergers and acquisitions.
Not only could you get tremendous power, you could actually become a monopoly. I mean, if right now in the cell phone provider industry, we've got AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and then a bunch of little other systems that use those three carriers for their phone services. So we've got three companies, and if AT&T and Verizon were to merge, you'd have one behemoth, and then you'd have the one little scrappy underdog, T-Mobile, um, which it'd be much easier for this AT&T Verizon mega corporation to then exert pressure to force T-Mobile out of the industry. So that would be through merger and acquisition the potential for a monopoly.
Yeah, I don't doubt that monopolies or monopoly power can be achieved. One would wonder what sort of government regulation and interference there is in that industry. I haven't looked at it. But they could exert some sort of a power. And then one would say, okay, well, how long is it going to last? I mean, we talk sometimes about this market power as if when companies do bad things, there's going to be no repercussions. What I mean by that is if they created this big behemoth and provided great service, then I don't think anybody would be too worried. But if all of a sudden they raised prices and said, great, we've got no competition, we can provide bad customer service, then people are going to look for every excuse to find somebody else, a small provider, even if it's not, maybe the service quality isn't quite as good, and then say, I'm never going back to that other company. I mean, I think it would be difficult for them to create that behemoth and provide terrible service at high costs and expect to keep that sort of market power.
Without government assistance.
Without government assistance. Once government steps in, then yes, they can keep it.
Yeah, because I was going to bring up when Bell was the big or the only phone provider. One of the things they did was that you had to buy their equipment. There was other companies out there providing equipment, but it was so cost prohibitive to use their equipment that you basically had to buy their equipment. And that was why there was very little innovation in the handsets for a number of years, until they lost the monopoly on the provider. But it does bring up an interesting point that the monopoly doesn't just have to be in a particular arena, like in phone service with Bell, but also in that whole chain of products. And in this case, one of the consequences was that they were the supplier of the hardware as well that you had in your home. That it wasn't just the phone lines and the service that you had.
I totally agree. But all of these things that you're talking about came because the government assisted in the creation of a monopoly.
Well, and it's hard. Can't argue that point. The government definitely had, was involved in that process. It's hard to say whether that Bell would have been able to maintain that stranglehold they had on the industry without government's help or not. Because if they own all the wires if they have all of the service, if they have all the hardware, I'm not sure how another company could even break in until the government broke apart the bells. And it wasn't just they broke them apart, but they took away that hardware requirement or hardware monopoly.
Yeah. Yeah. Nobody could have broken apart the monopoly that government had created.
Yeah, I'm not arguing that point.
Or,
I'm
and I think they could have if government would have stepped out and stopped stamping out competition. Then they would have been able to break apart that monopoly without their help. The only reason, I mean, give me another example of a monopoly as long lasting as Ma Bell that didn't have government assistance.
I don't have one. I also haven't looked for one. Um, and one could argue the reason why there hasn't been one is because the governments have gone through and broken them up. I mean, as you and I have discussed earlier, governments have had laws against monopolies going back, before the time of Jesus.
Uh huh. Yeah, I guess a couple of examples I would give that seem to contradict that are one, if we look back at Windows, you know, the government was preparing antitrust lawsuits against Windows
Yeah,
in the early 2000s. It wasn't necessary because they began to lose some of their market share. John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil in the early 1900s, they they broke up the Standard Oil into a number of different sub entities that still exist today. And there's a huge argument to be made that right at that time when they were doing that, oil was being discovered in the Middle East and in Russia, and they would have lost a ton of their market power anyway. I mean, when you look at Standard Oil is a great example of why sometimes it takes a while for competition to flourish. I mean, in his case, he kept prices low, but there was a scarce amount of resources. There was only so much oil. It was discovered in Titusville, Pennsylvania. It was really big in Pennsylvania at first, and it didn't end up, they didn't find it in Oklahoma or Texas till years and years later. But all that oil, he was able, through mergers and acquisitions, through government interference, and through keeping his prices low, to stamp out a lot of competition. But all those years when he was trying to merge with and acquire all these other companies so they could all be under Standard Oil, there were always some businessmen that hated him and wouldn't concede. And even though it might have been in their best interest, they wanted to fight against him because they didn't like what he was doing. So that competition is just difficult to, even with mergers and acquisitions, to stamp all of that out, because there's going to be people that disagree. Or if you raise the prices, then all of a sudden there's huge incentive for people to come in, invest the money, and find ways to compete with you. But when there's government, that's where you get the long-lasting instances of monopolies. And I think, go ahead. Sorry.
well, it seems to me that your platform essentially is that long-lasting monopolies will only happen with government intervention. And so if we were to pull government entirely out of the interference, either with the breaking up of monopolies or maintaining monopolies or whatever it might be, that the market would always self-correct. And my response to that is always going to be, you're correct, but the damage is going to impact a lot of people. Um, we only have to look to the housing crisis to see how badly it can get for certain people, or to the stock market crash in the 29. And of course, none of those were monopoly based. I'm not making that argument. I'm only trying to argue that government oversight, if it had been a little more stringent and careful, could have avoided some of that pain and loss that occurred in those times. And so government oversight is often managed badly, but that means that we need to go in and correct it, and to ensure that we can fix the ways in which the government is managing these things, and ensure that it is done with the best interest of the consumer, or the most people, not just the consumer, but the most people as possible.
Yeah. It's interesting those points you bring up. There's books written about how the Great Depression was extended by the actions of government, and not with malicious intent,
Sure.
but it was years, and the government kept making poor decisions that extended the length of the Great Depression. The only thing that pulled us out was a terrible war.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, when I look back at history of what's happened, government just has not done that. Um, Government has often made things has been the one that's made things worse. Here's another example. As you were talking about cable and saying that there's a government-sponsored monopoly, I did a search on your address to look at Starlink, the new internet service provider that Elon Musk has come up with,
Oh yeah,
and it's available in your area.
really? I'm looking that up.
Free
Starlink. Huh?
market. The free market saved you again, in spite of the fact that the government's doing its best to extend the monopoly.
Well, I mean, there is what after I was talking about that, I did realize that there is one other option that's available in my area, and that T-Mobile is doing a 5G Wi-Fi internet, and I tried using it here at the house, and we just don't get good service. We're just in that area. We're not rural by any means, but I guess we're just not. It's not the population density isn't large enough for that to be effective. I'll look into that Starlink, and hopefully it's not another one, a 5G solution that's similar to the T-Mobile, because I'm not hopeful if that's the case. Um, but it does sort of transition into the argument or the idea that if you left it entirely up to the country, up to the companies, made it entirely free market, they focus where the profits are. And so if you think about service providers like cell phones or telephones or utilities, they make the most money where the population is the most dense. And so they would, be very happy to go and provide electricity to cities and larger towns, but they don't want to run the wires out into the country where their population is thinner, and you have to spend more money in order to hook up fewer people. And so sometimes the government has required some of these providers that if we're going to give you, let's say, this contract in a larger population area, we're going to require you then to also provide service in some of these lower population areas. And the reason being that companies are motivated by profit. They go where they make the most profit for the least amount of cost. Government is supposed to be motivated, for the good of the people. And regardless of where you live, they want to make sure that everybody has access to the mail service. Everybody has access to electricity. Everybody has access to running water, even if it's a little more expensive to get the services to those people.
That's a very good point. But what I would say about that is, as I was researching Ma Bell, one of the things that the government did that had the unintended consequence of stifling competition was they required an averaging of rates. So in some areas of the country, it was very expensive to run phone lines. So you're right, the incentive was to raise the prices in those areas of the country because it costs more to provide service to somebody in the backwoods of Tennessee or something, or in the Ozarks. It's very expensive so they said to Ma Bell, you can't charge exorbitant rates to those customers. You need to average those out. So raise the rates of people in the city to cover some of the expense of providing service to those people in those outlying areas, which had the unintended consequence of stifling competition. Because if there were another company that says, hey, I can go to this area and I can specialize here, there's good profits to be made because it is expensive to run phone lines up here, but it's worth my while because there's high costs, then a company might be incentivized to do that. But when they go there and they say, oh my gosh, how can I compete with Ma Bell in this area because they must be losing money, the rates that they're charging. So I can't provide any competition here because Ma Bell is already providing prices at such low rates. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The government provided that, trying to help. The government provided a requirement for Ma Bell to have low prices in those outlying areas, which restricted people from competing in those areas.
I hear your point, and the problem I have with the argument you're putting forth is that it really looks at it as one possible outcome, and so I'm going to offer you another one. You have these depressed prices, and typically, not always, but typically, rural areas, people have less money, they make less money, they spend less money. There's less money to go around. So there's more. The expenses are higher in the city. People make more money in the city. You find, and of course, there are some people that that are very wealthy and own a 100,000 acre ranch out in the middle of Texas. I'm not talking about those people, but the people that are that are farming, subsistence farming, or have some a mining job or whatever. Those are the people that don't have a lot of money, and so to say that a company is can no longer go into those areas because the prices are unnaturally low because of government oversight, well, it's also more likely that those prices that are naturally low are still expensive to someone that is making a minute or living a minimum wage existence, uh, rather than living in the big city where they might make more money and probably have access to more amenities.
And why did the government have to regulate those prices?
Because if you run a mile of wire in the city and you have 1,000 customers on that mile of wire versus running a mile of wire in the country and you've got two customers on that mile of wire, well, think about how many people you have to use to offset your cost.
No, I get that, Brian. I get why the prices would be high. But you said, well, if the prices were high, nobody would be able to afford it, so nobody would have paid those higher prices. Well, if that were true, then the government wouldn't have to regulate the prices.
Well, I mean, their motivation is not to. Their motivation is to get the service out to the people in the country.
Whose
In this
motivation?
in this small aspect that we're talking about.
The government's motivation?
Yes, when in the flattening of the prices is to bring services to the country where when it didn't have electricity. When mom was talk about growing up on the farm or visiting the farm, they didn't have running water back then, and this was in the 50s. They
But
were still using that.
their motivation doesn't matter. The results are what matter. Unintended consequences are what matter. So, yeah, their intent was to provide a great service to poor people in the country. And what I'm saying is they failed. I mean, your argument is, listen, if the government had it regulated prices would have been too high in the countryside because people couldn't have afforded it. Well, the companies are only going to offer whatever can be afforded. So if you're saying, well, the government forced them to take telephone out to those areas, maybe it did, maybe it didn't. The point is, it stifled competition because nobody else could go there. The only way that somebody's going to go there is if they think it's worth their while, right? Well, Ma Bell's going to go there only when they think they're going to get. Ma Bell's got no incentive to go out and grow in the countryside in those outlying rural areas because they know if they go there, they can't charge high prices. So they're going to expand as slowly as possible in those areas. Right. Now, if prices were high, then some company might say, hey, let's take a chance. Let's make an investment. Now, if they start charging prices that nobody can afford, then their business venture fails. But they go and look to expand into those outlying areas, an incentive that Ma Bell doesn't have and those competitors don't have if the government says you can't charge high prices. Price is a very effective way to decide when it's worthwhile to invest in a certain area. And if you remove that incentive, then nobody's going to invest in that area.
Well, I mean, I get what you're saying, and it depends a little bit on. Well, first of all, let me say we're talking about government regulation in an industry that that was way over-regulated. The fact that you had a government-mandated monopoly, I'm not going to argue with that point. But really, what it comes down to is it possible that another company could have gone in there, provided that service to those people, and made a profit at the same time? Maybe. I don't really know. And so government had excessively depressed prices. It's possible that those prices were actually the only thing that was affordable to those people without a lot of in-depth research on both of our parts. This is really an area that it's really difficult to determine whether even without that monopoly at those prices, could somebody else have gone in there and matched the prices, beat the prices, or would those prices have kept out other people as well? We don't really know. It's really hard to say.
I don't
We're
think it is.
getting near the 40-minute. Oh no, we got a few more minutes. I'm sorry. Go ahead. Say what you want to say.
Well, I guess what I would say is, yeah, I mean, economics tells you that when prices can adjust, that eventually somebody's going to go in there. I mean, it's not going to
Eventually,
happen but it's not going to happen when prices are low, because Ma Bell says, why expand? Ma Bell is going to find every reason not to go there because there's no benefit. If Ma Bell, like every other corporation, is interested in profits, they're going to say, I lose money in those areas. But based on what you were saying before, based on what I was saying before, you've got to charge more money in those areas or you lose money in those areas. And if the government is forcing you to keep the prices down in those areas, then there's no incentive to go there. So they find every reason not to.
yeah.
Now, sooner or later, if there is competition and you can charge what you want, you find a customer that it's worth their while. Maybe it's that wealthy guy that's got, a 100,000-acre ranch. Or maybe it's a few of those guys together. Or maybe you just say people finally have enough money in those areas that they can afford higher rates than you get in the city because they don't have some of the other expenses of the city. There's no incentive to go when there's restricted pricing.
Yeah, you're right. And I do agree at some point the problem would have been fixed through the marketplace. The question is, would that have been 10 years or 100 years? And I'll give you a personal example of this sort of thing. When I was living in Asheville, up in the mountains of North Carolina, there was a hurricane. It didn't impact us, but it impacted one of the refineries, I think, in Virginia. And so in that mid-Atlantic area in the southern states, there was a shortage of gasoline while they were waiting for the refinery to get up and running again. And so everyone's waiting patiently. All the gas stations ran out of gas. And so then the trucks started going out into the different areas and bringing the gasoline. Well, the companies that were delivering, they had, I'm going to simplify it and say they had two options. They could take that one truck, go into Charlotte or Raleigh or Columbia, and go in within 4 hours, empty out their entire truck, and then go back and get another load out there, again, so they get two loads a day, or they can go into the rural areas where it might take them 12 hours to empty out the truck. And so what we found up in the mountains of North Carolina, we weren't getting any gas. The big cities down in the country were getting lots of gas, and the government had to step in and say, no, you cannot wait until 6 months, or not six, that's an exaggeration. It probably would have been a couple of weeks before they came out to our area. Meanwhile, you have people that can't go to work, people that can't go to the grocery store, people that can't take care of basic needs because they don't have gas in their car.
That's a very specific example. Yeah, you could be right in that particular case. I can't say that government stepping in is never a good idea. First of all, I think, all we're talking about as far as government interference is the interference into monopolies. Government should enforce contract. There is a place for government. And even in monopolies, probably at certain times, maybe they do help. I just think on balance, they're not going to. One example of this is, and I don't know exactly what happened in your scenario, when there's a hurricane or a natural disaster at some point, sometimes the government will say they'll exert price controls. And they'll say, hey, you can't charge too much money. It's unfair to these customers. Well, for example, if you had a gas station in a particular area and the gas station still has to charge $3 per gallon or $4 per gallon, well, there's not a huge amount of incentive to the oil company to make extra effort to go out there. Whereas if they could sell gas at $12, $20, $30, if somebody were willing to buy it, then they're saying, oh my gosh, let's get out there because it's worth our while now. So many times the government, in trying to help people and say, hey, we want to do the best thing, they're restricting the opportunity of companies to fulfill a need. because if people really need it, they're willing to pay extra money for it. If there's some corporation that says, "Hey, we need gas out here. We'll pay $30 for it. It's worth our time. We're losing money, or we need to satisfy our customers," but they can't get gas out there. They can't have gas brought to them because the oil companies are saying, "Listen, I can't go all the way to some outlying area and charge only $3. I'm going to lose a massive amount of money." So when government just steps back and lets the free market decide what's best, yeah, sometimes it is difficult. It's not always the best choice. But once again, we're talking about a trade-off. And government oftentimes makes more problems than they solve, as we can see with Ma Bell and Standard Oil and all these other examples. But
And you brought up a good point, and it's one that I would love to dig more into. So I made another note that I would like at some point to have a conversation about price fixing and emergencies, and I'm sure we can expand or massage that because I think it would be a fun topic for us to have as well.
yeah,
We're getting near the point where we're going to get cut off from the recording's going to get cut off. So if we maybe just last kind of a summary of perspectives. I think once again you and I have come across a point that we tend to agree that a certain amount of free market is good, a certain amount of government oversight is good, and we just disagree on how much between those, the balance between the two. And I think that we have some, although I tend to be aligning more with government managing and making sure that people aren't being taken advantage of. We've got some examples around today where government has mandated monopolies, and we see how frustrating it can be for the consumer. This guy right here. In some of the most examples, I think that they could do a better job of controlling it, but then there's some examples where I feel like they should back off a little bit.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I look back at history, it's just hard for me to find an example of a company that had monopoly power without the assistance of government that was very long lasting. And there's plenty of examples of companies that exerted market power, monopoly power for years and years because of government assistance, and those last a long time. And many times when we talk about, how risky it is to have, companies in the free market and the government should protect us, I think it's actually much easier to ask for help, or to vote in the free market than it is to vote in real life. I mean, if you wanted to make a change about a government monopoly of some sort, think of all the things you'd have to vote, and your one vote, if you happen to, how do you find a candidate that happens to be on your side on that issue? What if they disagree with you on everything else, like abortion and foreign policy, everything else? You want to have to vote for them in that area because it suits you. Whereas a company, you just don't pay them. You wait for competition, just like we did with Starlink. Look into Starlink. I think you'll find that. I don't know how great the service is in your area, but it's just amazing that he's carpeting the whole globe with satellites that's going to do away with all the lines, the cable that we needed in the past. So
that'd be great. Okay, I will. All right, that was fun, Colin. Thank you.
Thank you.
We hope you learned something in this episode of Brother versus Brother, a podcast about difficult conversations. We also hope that you enjoyed it enough to subscribe to the podcast. You can help us by spreading the word. Share this episode on your favorite social media so that others will have an opportunity to experience it as well. You can also support us by donating through Patreon. This information and more can be found on our website, broconvo.com, and on our various social media accounts. Thank you.